going to be talking to Cumbrian writer Mike Smith. Mike's been writing for decades now and writes poetry, novellas and plays, but the main focus of my discussion with him today is going to be about the short story. Mike, how did your childhood shape your work and contribute to your development as a writer?
Good question. Well, I was an adopted only child of older parents, and that not so rare these days, but when I was a kid it was fairly rare. And so I suppose I had that thing that writers often talk about, of having time and my own company. And I was writing stories from quite early on, I think. I was certainly aware of writing. I was very much into Kipling, The Jungle Book, and particularly the poems in the edition I had, which I don't have anymore. There were a lot of poems at the back, and I can remember reading those out at school. So I was into reading stuff out as well, quite early on. And I can remember, I don't know when I would have been 10, 11, 12, something like that, writing quite a long story. Certainly long by comparison to what I was doing at school. I don't think it was any good, and I haven't got that. And very derivative of what I was watching on TV at the time. So yeah, so it had an impact. By the time I was at secondary school, I was into writing and reading, and I think I was also into reading as a writer. I only won one school prize, as far as I can recall, ever, and that was, I think it was something, it was called the Debating Prize or the Magazine Prize or something. And I can remember I got James Joyce's works with the prize money. Which,
prize.
Yeah, quite. And that was quite interesting because it was picked up on when I received the prize. You know, you haven't read this stuff, have you? Sort of, and I had by then. I don't think I'd read all of Finnegan's Wake, but I certainly read Ulysses a couple of times before I left school. So and I was interested in it from a writing perspective, I think, curiously.
That's quite precocious for a young person, isn't it? You know, it's fantastic that you're engaging with such a high level of literary text at such an age.
Yeah, I mean, there were teachers that encouraged us latterly. In the last few years of my schooling, in fourth, fifth, and sixth forms, there was a sort of an input of younger teachers came to the school. And most of the teachers had been men who'd served in the Second World War. But in those last few years, we suddenly got much younger teachers. And I can remember one being very, very passionate about writing. He took us to Derby Rep to see the mystery plays. Oh. And he was, I can remember him getting so excited about the mystery plays, you thought he was almost going to burst into tears. And that was a man called Chris Shepherd who went on to be a bookseller. And I met him when I worked in the book trade. I met him several times subsequently. But he was genuinely passionate about what had been written. And when you experience that, I think it gives you permission to be the same, if you like. It puts the idea into your head that it's appropriate to be involved, you know, to allow yourself to become really deeply involved and passionate about writing. So yeah,
that's wonderful to have those influences. I think when you're such
yeah, I mean, and it's a story I think you read and you hear over and over again that people who are interested in reading and writing will have often been sort of switched on to that by their teachers. I never saw either of my parents read a book, never, ever. My dad had 4 books, and they were in a little pile used as a doorstop.
Goodness.
You know, and that was it.
I understand that you use 2 different names as a writer, Mike Smith and Brindley Hallam Dennis. Could you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Well, yeah, and it's not really a pseudonym. It's who I really should have been, because as an adoptee, I'd always known I'd been adopted, but when I was in my sort of late-ish 40s, my wife was doing some research on family history and tracked me down and discovered that though I'd lived my life as Mike Smith, I should have been Brindley Hallam Dennis. And it was quite cathartic. It was unexpected, completely unexpected. I hadn't crossed my mind that you would be given a name. I'd always assumed that an adoptee would be sort of like child number 32 or something. And so it took me completely by surprise. And it unblocked me. I had, in my 20s and 30s, I wrote poetry and got quite a bit of it published in some very good magazines too. But I'd been blocked for about, I don't know, 12, 15 years. I wanted to write and I tried to write, but I couldn't. And discovering that I should have been this other character is really what got me going again. And it started me writing stories as opposed to poems. And so I've adopted the name for my fiction writing. Still write other things as Mike Smith, write poetry, write plays, write essays as Mike Smith, but fiction as Brindley Hallam Dennis. And in some respects I explain that to myself as, you know, I don't know who this character would have been. So maybe stories explore who characters might be. I don't know. Maybe that's why.
I can imagine that being quite liberating as a writer.
Absolutely.
Because we adopt personalities to write anyway, and you've got a whole new person to explore and discover that.
That's right. And also it came. And also it came after I'd had a brush with a life-threatening disease. So it came the name came at a good time, you know, in life, at a point of renewal and starting again. So yes.
Do you have a favourite place to write, or can you write anywhere?
I've had to write anywhere because I've never had a place, and I tend to be one of those writers that writes in notebooks, and I always have a notebook with me. And several years ago I started numbering them, and I'm now on number 93, I think. The plan was that I would go through them and pull out all the good things, but in fact I have now three basketfuls of old notebooks that I haven't looked at since I put them in the basket. But that my process is often to start in the notebook, then transfer to the computer and work on the computer. And they're not always, but that's the normal process, which frees you from needing a place. I have had various places around the house that I've tended to work in at different times, but they've not been to do with the writing so much as to do with the physicality of the house and where I've been able to work. So I reckon I can write anywhere.
So for how long do you explore an initial idea in your notebook before you begin writing on a computer?
Well, I think by the time it goes in the notebook, I've often been turning it over in my mind for a while. I do a lot of work outside, physical labouring, and that gives you a lot of headspace. So I rehearse scenes. I wouldn't say I get them word perfect, but I do rehearse stories and scenes and explore them. And then I go back to the notebook. The notebook comes out after the thought, and pretty quickly after that it gets to the computer. There is a luxury in being able to leave a story and come back to it, and the longer you can do that, it's like a cheddar, or you know, it matures. But there's always an excitement about a story. You write a story, and there's always an excitement that makes you want to progress it there and then. But over the last sort of almost 20 years now, I've been writing literally hundreds of stories. And I'm now starting to look back at quite old ones that were abandoned or I felt didn't quite work. And it's interesting to look back at them and see them in a completely detached way, and you can see often why they didn't work. And so I do find that now I'm going back over a lot of quite old stories and fixing them, ones that were abandoned before. I'm sort of doing repairs or rewrites even, and that's quite interesting.
Yeah, because I suppose having continued to write for however many decades since those original ideas, you'll have developed many other techniques, learnt a lot more, read a lot more, and actually it won't even just be kind of a little reworking job, a fixing job, but you'll be able to get to the root of it, I imagine, and develop the whole thing.
Yeah, I think there's something in that. I think one of the big problems that writers face, and certainly from my experience anyway, is knowing what you've written. You know what you wanted to write often, and you know what you think you've written, but you have to have a measure of detachment to get any inkling of what a completely disconnected reader will think you've written and will see that you have actually written. And I think that's the big skill, I suppose, that writers have to develop, the ability to stand back from their own work. And you can develop it to a certain extent, but there's nothing like time for giving you detachment. Yeah. And then you go back to a story that you'd forgotten you've written, and you say, "Oh, this is interesting," you know. And, but why does it do this there? Why that's silly, you know. Why has it gone off the subject, you know? Why? And you can see things that when you were emotionally connected, I suppose, you couldn't see, and so you get the chance to rework them or to try again or whatever. And that's an interesting sort of activity in itself.
Good. Do you have a writing routine, and if so, what is it?
I try to have a writing routine, but I don't have one because everything else gets in the way. I go through periods that maybe last for matters of months, or maybe 18 months, maybe 2 years, where a particular day is always going to be clear for writing. But even when it is, it doesn't necessarily mean that I will write. I'm rather a fan of Stephen King's book on writing, and he talks about, you know, only writing when he's inspired, but making sure he's inspired at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning or whatever it is. But he's a professional writer, I mean, and I'm not. But there's a lot of sense in that approach of being able to do it when you've got the chance to do it, or when you have the time to do it, whether that's an allocated time or whatever. So I do try to keep time available. But having said that, I often find that, you know, I'm sitting up late at night, tired. Being tired is almost an altered state of consciousness, and the notebook comes out, and I'll write stuff down. And sometimes with a commentary, like you're just filling time here, or you know, I'll be writing a letter, writing a story, and I'll find that I'm writing comments in it, like, "Why are you writing this?" You know, and it's because you want to write, but you haven't got anything to say. So, but I do often find I'm writing late at night. That's not planned.
So the interesting altered state of mind then, though often you might just be writing a commentary, I hadn't thought of it before, but actually it's another creative opportunity where there are perhaps fewer parameters, where in addition to some of perhaps the banal commentaries that you write, you could actually come out with some interesting ideas.
Oh yeah, you do. I mean, it's like when people give you writing exercises. You know, you say, "I don't want to write about this." And then you sit down and write yourself into it, and you find something that you do want to say, and that you do think needs to be said, and that can be good. I mean, I've certainly found that with poetry. You know, some of the most successful, whatever that word means, of the poems I've written have come out of sort of workshop exercises where I was confronted with something, you know, I don't know, I don't want to write about that, and then something good comes out of it. I mean, a lot of workshop exercises generally are hooks and tricks to trawl the subconscious. And, you know, you sit down and try to write when you're tired or late at night. That's a trick for trawling the subconscious, if ever there was one, you know. So, you know, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But if you've been thinking about a story, if you've been, let's say, rehearsing a story while you've been doing something else, something mundane and physical, then there can be that situation where you're ready to sit down and write it formally, yes, because you know what the story is. It's been going around in your head, and you think, yeah, now I just want to tell this story, and that's a different sort of approach, and works. You know, you can make it work.
How long does it take you to write a short story?
I suppose you're going to measure it in minutes and hours, really. I mean, most of what I write is less than 2,000 words. I do write short pieces, and a lot around 500 words, 500 to 1,000 words. And writing it down doesn't necessarily take very long, but the process of having thought about it, that can be spread over days. And then the process of going back and looking at it and reworking it and thinking, you know, is this what I wanted to say? Does this say what I wanted to say? Again, that can spread over an enormous length of time. As I was saying before, you know, you come back to them years later, particularly the ones that you think haven't worked. You know, there's something niggles about them, and you come back to them, back to them, back to them. Find out what it is that niggles, and then maybe you can fix it. So you could argue they take years. There's a Hemingway reference in I think it's in one of the Paris Review interviews, where he talks about a day in which he wrote 3 short stories. I can't remember which ones they are now, but he was fired up, you know, and he was being plied with drink. He was in a hotel somewhere in Spain, I think, or Italy or somewhere. Maybe it was Italy.
A good way to release the subconscious.
Yeah, you know, and he was going, and he was being encouraged. You know, the waiter was bringing in food and drink, and he knew he was doing something unusual. That he was firing off one story after another, and yeah, great. We can sort of intellectualize and talk about it. When I was at school, we were taught to write, and we were taught to write stories, and I think maybe it's a generation thing, but it seemed to me that I was always being told that this is something that you do with 90% perspiration and 10% inspiration, and that may be true. It may not be true. I don't know, but it's something that has to be examined as an idea. And the bulk of a story may well come out in a few minutes. Maybe you play around with it for hours and hours and hours later. But it's not necessarily a painstaking thing. Having said which, I have a friend that if he gets 400 words onto a page in a day, feels he's done really well. Yeah. And certainly when I was writing, not a short story, but the novel I wrote, A Penny Spitfire, you know, there were days when I would write 4,000 or 5,000 words. I would maybe junk a lot of them later, but
my goodness, that's a lot
of words. But it was, you know, it was pouring out. I knew the story, you know, and I knew more of the story than I had the stamina to write down in one sitting, you know, and I think you get that way when you know the story and you have a need to tell it.
Is a short story ever truly finished?
Well, I mean, they say it of poetry, don't they? That poems are only abandoned; they're never finished. And I think there might be something true. There's an interesting argument about that. between, although not directly with each other, but between Tobias Wolff and H.E. Bates in two introductions to collections of short stories. The Wolff one is fairly recent, and he talks about republishing stories that were written 30 years ago, and he has fixed them. And then in an H.E. Bates introduction from the late 1930s, he talks about not doing that, and makes the point that artists don't go into galleries and touch up their paintings, you know, and that you should abandon it. So there are 2 points of view, and pretty high-powered short story writers espouse both of them. And
what do you think?
I suppose I'm with Wolff where I see the need, and I'm with Bates where I don't.
Yes, that makes
you
sense.
know, and also where I haven't got a fix. If I can't see what I can do with it, then I'm going to go with Bates. No, I really shouldn't touch it.
Yeah.
But if I can think, oh yeah, I can see something I can do with that story, then I'm with Wolff, and I'll say, oh yeah, go back and have another go. Why not? I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. I think both are true in their
Yes.
in their appropriate places.
Different writers have different views about showing their work to others whilst it's in progress. Some people are quite superstitious about it, I think, and just absolutely won't show them until they've got a good first draft finished. What's your view on this? Are you happy to share your work with others while it's still in its infancy, or not?
Well, it's interesting you say superstitious. I mean, the one thing I am superstitious about is if you have an idea for a story, for heaven's sake, don't tell it to anybody before you've written it down, because once you've told the story to someone, I suspect you can't write it down, you know, because it doesn't need to be written down. You've done it, it's been told, and it's gone. And you can talk. I think of that as talking it out. You can talk a story out, but somewhere in the process, it's a great idea to have somebody who has the detachment that you haven't got look at it and say, are you on the right lines here, or are you on the wrong lines? And it's very good if, as a writer, you've got a group of writing buddies that you can do that with, whose opinions you respect. But it's got to be fairly well on in the process for me.
Yes.
You know, it's got to be a first or second finished draft, not just notes, but you know, it's got to be down, complete, and reasonably worked. And then you can say, what do you think of this? Do you think and then listen to what's said. And I always think that when people are telling you something about your writing, what you're listening for is something which resonates with an idea that's already in your mind. So if they're telling you something that's completely unexpected, I mean, it can be right, but it's probably not going to be that helpful. It's when they say something and you think, yeah, that little bell's been ringing in my head already, and I've been ignoring it or denying it, or I couldn't quite put my finger on it. That's when the advice, I think, is good. And it's and they're telling you something that you're just on the verge of knowing about the piece of writing. Then that can be helpful. I think when it's something completely off the wall, it's probably less helpful. Okay. That's been my experience anyway. So I do it late on in the process. But I mean, it has made me abandon one or two stories. You know, somebody comes back and says, "No, you're way off beam. This isn't doing anything." You know, and you think, yeah, that's right. Of course that's right. I think that's the answer. You know, if you think, of course that's right, then you know you've got good advice. And it's worked other ways where you send something that you're fairly pleased with, and somebody comes back and says, "Oh, this is one of the best things you've written." That's good. You think, yeah, that's great. You know, it's nice to be told that. You think, and that happens too, and that's good. But especially when it comes from the same people who've told you, no, this is rubbish, because you tend to trust that sort of opinion. If you know they'll give you the bad news, then you trust them with the good news.
So it's good really to set up a small group probably of like-minded readers, perhaps and writers, just a few, and bounce off one another. I think that's something you do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's useful. I know some people don't, and that's fine. We all have different processes.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I've worked with other writers for years now in different groups, and I think it's very helpful and very valuable. And critiquing other people's work it gives you a fresh eye to go back to your own work. I mean, yes. you see things in other people's work, and you're talking about it, and the penny starts to drop. Actually, I'm telling myself something here, and you'll go back to a particular story and then think, yeah, that's in this too. It's got to come out, or the gap has got to be filled in. So yeah, I do think it's good to have other people. I think also because for me, I see myself as an amateur writer, very much so. It's an activity that I enjoy doing. Like you might play golf, or you might go fishing, or you might play sport. And it's an activity, and activities are, I think, often enhanced by being shared, yes, with people that are enjoying them as well. I don't see it as a job or as a profession. I'm an amateur writer. I do it because I love it.
Which writers have had the greatest impact on you?
So, a lot of the people who've had an influence on me are the people in the groups we've just talked about. The little groups. I have an American friend called Kurt Tidmore, who is a largely unpublished writer, but he's a tremendously good writer of short stories, and he writes in that short, sharp, declarative sentences style, and in many respects he's had a big impact on me because of the way he writes. I like that voice. I like the power in the other hand, Joyce, Cormac McCarthy, the novelist Cormac McCarthy, wonderful. Fascinating. I don't think he's got much to say, but by gosh, he's got a wonderful way of saying it, and short story writers, H.E. Bates, A.E. Coppard, V.S. Pritchett, I think are three fascinating English short story writers. They were writing over the same period of time, with a big overlap anyway. And if there is an English school of short story writers, they've got to be three of the big names, the three biggest, I would say, in it. People like Arthur Morrison, not so well known, from writing the sort of 1890s period. Mary Mann, Elizabeth Taylor, one or two. Yeah, I find that when I start talking about other writers, I very soon move from writers in general to particular stories.
Yes.
It's particular stories that influence you by a whole plethora of different writers.
Perhaps you could mention one or two of those stories,
well,
and say what it was.
The Blush by Elizabeth Taylor. I mean, it's a fascinating story. It's classic. It's short in the short story form. You have basically an interaction between a sort of middle class woman and a housekeeper, and a series of convoluted events seen through the eyes of this woman, and then a realization of the significance of what's happened, which causes her to blush. And that's the story. The end of the story is the blush. And it's such a clever story. It's brilliant. And it works in this strange way that when you get to the end of the story and this woman goes to the mirror, she is so amazed by the blush herself that she goes to the mirror to look at it and see herself. And as the blush spreads through her, the realisation of, or the question of why she's blushing spreads through you, and you start to review the story and to think, what's she got to blush about? And there are so many different possibilities in the story. It's just so clever. It takes you to this point of of realisation and perception. And then there's stories like Weep Not My Wanton by A. Coppard. It's only 4 pages long. It's a family walking across a field, basically, and the interaction between the father and the son and the mother, and there's so much buried in it, in this short story. There's an amazing event which isn't quite at the end of the story, which is often the case with short stories. And you think that that event is so stark and so surprising that's the point of the story. And then there's a bit added on that you think, well, what's that bit there for? Because we've had the climax of the story. And it makes you think a bit further and think, actually, it's the bit at the end is what you have to think about. Why is that there? Because the drama is over. Why is that there? And it's something to do with putting that drama into a context. Such a clever story. Ambrose Bierce stories with their amazing endings, and they're often stories about death or the moments of death or after death. Which had led one commentator, I can't remember who, but one commentator suggesting that Bierce, who suffered a serious head wound in the American Civil War, was not sure that he wasn't dying. He wasn't sure that the rest of his life wasn't the moment of dying. And so many of his stories are about that sort of experience his characters have. I think it's called Incident at Owl Creek Bridge is the famous one, where the guy is hung from the bridge and has this fantasy as he is hanging of the rope having broken and hitting the river and swimming away and climbing up the bank and running off through the woods. But it's not happened. He's It's the short stories are fabulous things, and there are so many of them. But yeah, and it's individual ones that influence you. Think, wow, can I do that? In fact, when I think about what I'm trying to do when I'm writing a short story, nearly every short story I write will have something, a technique, an approach, a viewpoint, a narrative voice. There'll be some element that you could say is a sort of experiment.
Yes.
Can I do this? Can I make this work? Can I lead the reader to a point of possible perception of something by taking them on this particular route in this particular way? So yeah, you're more. I think you're more influenced by individual stories than you are by writers as a whole, by an individual writer's work in general.
Mike Smith, Brindley Hallam Dennis, thank you very much for joining us today.
You're welcome.
If you've enjoyed this interview and would like to find out more about creative writing, then look at my website, darrenharper.net, where there are courses and resources available.